Welcome back, guys, to the Beyond Condition podcast, the voice of bodybuilding. And today's voice is a brand new guest. And we've just before hitting record said how excited we are to actually bring something new to the podcast. Now, Dr. Lisa Lewis is joining us all the way from the other side of the globe. Thank you, Lisa, for joining us today.
Thank you for having me on. I'm excited.
Yeah, it's very good to have these opportunities. And of course, as you know, it came about from Paul O'Neill, who's a very good friend. He actually had you
Mm.
on his podcast and he messaged me on Instagram. He said, Sarah, you need to get Lisa on your podcast.
Aw, that's great. Well, good. I'm glad you reached out. And yeah, Paul, we had a great conversation. Got into some things I think that weren't necessarily like on the list to get to. So I love when that happens and hope we'll get to some good stuff today too.
Yeah, for sure. Now, for the listeners, it'd be really cool to have a bit of an intro into who you are, who you sort of speak with, who you coach, and what you do, and then we can get stuck into some topics.
Sure. Okay. So my name is Lisa Lewis. I'm a licensed clinical psychologist and I'm a certified addictions counselor. So I'm a therapist by trade. I've been practicing psychotherapy, which is therapy using talk, since 2003. So over 20 years now. I started off as a master's level therapist. And at the beginning of my career, I worked in detox and I worked in recovery programs for people who had just gotten out of detox. So I ran a program for people just out of detox, like their first 2 weeks in
Oh,
early recovery. And then after they completed that program, I got to work with them in individual therapy. So
yeah.
the origin story of being a counselor is in addiction, which is all about making change and readiness for change and the barriers to change and really trying to get out of your own way, stop doing something that's harmful. And I realized in doing that work that every single human being struggles with this in some way, shape, or form. Some are much more intense and life-threatening and all-consuming than others, of course. But that was sort of the beginning of my lens into mental health. And I worked in some psychiatric hospitals. And then I went back to school to get my doctoral degree in sport psychology. And so in that work, I got to, of course, work with athletes and work with very high achieving type A personalities who may not be practicing a sport, but are sort of athletes in life,
Yeah.
you know. So themes of like perfectionism and achievement and just pursuing greatness.
Mm,
And so in doing that work, I saw addiction. It looked different. Maybe people weren't using that word, but I certainly saw behaviors that would screw up people's lives, but they would keep doing anyway. And so when I finished that work, I worked in college mental health for a little while. Like my postdoctoral work was in colleges and universities, and that was wonderful because I got to be a generalist and work with every kind of person. Like the 9 a.m. client had just had a breakup with their boyfriend, and the 10 a.m. client was having their first psychotic episode. So, really, like the whole spectrum of mental health.
yeah.
And I knew I wanted to do something in the realm of working with people who wanted to grow themselves and develop themselves and push themselves. And I realized in college mental health, that's the human condition. When people are freed up enough, they naturally want to improve themselves. When I left college counseling, I taught for a little while at the university level here in Boston, and I opened private practice. And I started to see a lot of very high functioning people who were concerned about some kind of behavior. So maybe it was alcohol, it could be food, some other kind of substance, pornography addiction, shopping, gambling, et cetera, et cetera. But nobody would know that on the outside. On the outside, everything looked great and shiny and successful. And so I started realizing I had sort of had this avatar a handful of years into my practice of these kinds of really like rock stars in life,
Mm,
but who were grappling with something behind the scenes. Some of these people are athletes. I like to say I see athletes with issues, people who've got something going on with their mental health, but are still performing at a very high level. And then sort of parallel to that, my husband is in the fitness industry. He's a coach who does a lot of training of trainers. His name is Tony Gentilcore, and he was traveling around doing all different speaking engagements and be in these trainings, and coaches would be asking questions about how to work with people's motivation, how to work with clients who are very negative and suck the life out of you, and how to maintain professional boundaries with tricky clients. And he started saying, I feel like you should be asking my wife these questions. So that opened up a whole nother arm of my business, which is really continuing education for fitness professionals
Wow.
and addressing motivating your clients, client retention, managing client relationships, and really understanding your own psychology. You know, what are your psychological strengths? What are your blind spots? And how can you leverage your strengths and work on your blind spots so that you can do your best coaching
Mm,
with clients?
mm,
So I have a couple continuing education courses, and sometimes we'll get hired by gyms to come in and work with the staff. And part of that is really just kind of processing how intense the work can be to try to help people change, and what a setup there is in the fitness industry that you have to be like this magician that poof makes people change, preventing burnout. And then the other part is like how to feel really effective, because I think you do get educated in the X's and O's as a coach, but I don't really see out there a lot of good education for coaches on the psychology of coaching.
for sure, for sure. I love that as a journey because it's almost like I'm very into the universe. It's almost like the universe has guided you into these different realms. And for sure, what you said there about the coaching standpoint, I see it a lot in the bodybuilding space where, there's food disorders that are, heightened potentially by bodybuilding, or you've had a food disorder before and potentially you mask that and you say, well, now I'm a competitor, and we restrict food and what have you. And I
Mhm.
feel like there is this missing space, Lisa, where coaches are suddenly in a space where they have a client that potentially has exhibited these signs. They don't know what to do, but they don't want to leave them. And it's a tricky space because you can't, maybe you don't know where to seek the education, right? And it is hard because as the coach, you build the bond. It's like, where do I direct that person, if you know what I mean?
It's a really tricky relationship because, of course, and in those sports, I'm sure as you well know, there is a very high level of discipline and rigidity that is basically required once you get up to a heavy, high level. So the more demand there is from the sport, the more your vulnerabilities are going to be expressed. And so if you come from a history of having disordered thinking or behavior around your eating, that vulnerability is probably going to be exploited by that kind of a high pressure situation. So then, of course, the coach is like maybe seeing some signs of that presenting itself and thinking like, oh my gosh,
Yeah.
what do I what do I do? Even if they are following the rules and the guidelines, it still can, as you I see you nodding, it can get grow legs on it.
Yeah, for sure. And also, I feel like there is then going to be the element on the flip side of, you know, is the ability for the client wanting to change there. You mentioned at the start of your intro, it's like the ability to change starts with that acceptance, that want, and doing
Mm,
something about it. And again, if you're in this realm and you're masking it, maybe the coach doesn't know as well. So there's the flip side to it, isn't it? And that communication with a client, you can end up, as you say, leading to burnout or that type of stuff because you're heavily worried about what do I do here? I want to help X person, but
yeah.
I don't know what to do. And I guess a good question to you would be with the communication side of things. If you do start to pick up, I often label it sort of red flags, as it were, not to make it sound too
Yeah.
extreme. However, if you start to notice these things, I mean, I have different things within my toolkit as a coach, but anyone listening that does start to pick up signs and maybe needs to look at conversations with a client, is there certain recommendations you would give?
Yeah. And to piggyback on the last kind of topic you were bringing up, I recommend the approach of presenting it like wanting to create a team or take a team approach.
Mhm.
So I'm curious to hear what your tools might be in your toolbox, but of course you're not wanting to cross over into talking like a mental health professional, but you're the one who's seeing the signs. Like you really sometimes are the number one expert because you're hearing things and seeing things that nobody else can see. Even a spouse really can't see some of the detail that you can see, right? So you're in the best position to say what I say is observe and describe. So what's the data that you can reflect back to your client? Like, I'm just noticing the last 3 times we've met, you've called yourself A, B, and C, or you're describing to me you're worried so much affecting your sleep. Or I don't know if they're food journaling, maybe you're seeing that they're underdoing, I don't know, some of their macros or something. But that basically you can reflect that and say, I wonder if you've noticed that, and are you worried about that at all? What do you think? Kind of presenting it to them I like to use the expression, I wonder. Like, I wonder how you're feeling about it. I wonder what this means to you. And seeing if you can maybe get some collaboration with them, like, yeah, I think or if they're just going to straight up deny it, then that's a longer road, right? That's a longer game then. So thinking about working as a team, and I'll pause after this because I'm curious how you approach this. But once you present some data to your client, maybe that you're hearing a lot of negative self-talk, or you're seeing more anxiety or some kind of change in their eating behaviors, that you say, sometimes I recommend kind of bringing in another person on your team that might be someone who can help with the thinking or help with the anxiety. And I wonder if you've thought about maybe bringing in someone else just to kind of augment, your coaching and the support that you have.
Yeah, so without knowing it and having the frame sort of reflecting, that's essentially you're I'm nodding because it's like that's essentially what I do when I notice trends and different things with data. I've actually got a bit of a past with I'm unsure if it was a food disorder, as it were, but very neurotic ways of behaving around food, measuring food excessive times, etc., etc. So I'm very grateful to be in this position to have been through that and come out the other end, as it were, to be able to notice these things. And for sure, I'll offer a call, ideally a video call, so I can speak to the client because it's mainly online. Also,
Mm-hmm.
if I can meet them, I will. But also, it's about that team part. I love that. I love that because that is so true to my own coaching. And I feel like being able to express vulnerability as a coach, but not, there's a fine line, right? If you're just saying, oh, this has all happened to me, you're almost offloading on the client. But if you can resonate and if you can build that bond, I feel like you can put that reflective, you can ask questions and you can say, well, how does that make you feel when you say X negative thing about yourself? Or how does it make you feel when you're going out for a meal? And if you're overwhelmed, what does that actually feel like? What are you thinking at the time? If there's
Mm-hmm.
potential for more of the food disorder realm, then I do have people that I get on board as well and do like a trio, um, like
Mm-hmm.
calls, etc. And the reason I love that we've spoken about this is because it's something I recommend a lot because I don't feel it's not your due diligence as a coach if you know that someone has a food disorder and you're carrying on just going, this is your set food plan, just crack on. Have you got what it takes? This sort of reverse psychology of like, well, you're not a real bodybuilder. And it's like, that's a human there. And for
Mm-hmm.
sure, it's something that I do. I always, if it goes past a certain point, if I feel that this is more a food disorder than maybe some behaviors that I can help with, I absolutely would get a second person, as it were, for the trio.
Yeah. And I think that's best for the client. You get that other set of eyes on. You get, even if it's a second person saying, yeah, I think something's going on here. Sometimes that helps the client to kind of wake up and be like, okay, if two different people from two different lanes are expressing the same concern, and it's protective for you because you're not holding that, you're not sitting with that all by yourself. Like you're not up in the middle of the night, like, ah,
It
should I
happens.
do something? Like, is this okay? Is it not okay? That is the way to burnout, really, is to be holding that by yourself. So I think the team approach, I just wish that was more universal, that everybody thought like that. Like, let's just open this circle up as wide as it needs to go. And, we can work as an interdisciplinary team.
Mm,
So that's wonderful that you kind of bring that in and that you have go-tos. I think a lot of coaches don't have like a short list
mm,
of people they could call or recommend because people have a really hard time getting started in therapy because it's hard to find somebody and it's hard to know like, oh, if I just call up whoever therapist who's on the directory, are they going to understand thing one about my sport or what I need in order to compete or live this lifestyle I'm living.
yeah. I actually had a conversation with a friend in the industry not long ago, and she was saying, I'd be interested to know your thoughts. She was saying that a lot of competitive bodybuilders that do have probably the remit or however we want to frame that to maybe get some help from a psychologist don't like the label of having a coach and a psychologist, but she was like, I feel like actually that would raise the athlete to be even better at the sport and even more understanding of themselves and actually excel the coaching relationship. I wonder what your thoughts are there with the sort of label, as it were.
Oh my God, yes. I
Okay.
mean, I think a lot of my clients actually have reached out to me because it's sexier to say I'm going to get some performance psychology or some performance coaching than saying I'm going to get some mental health counseling. Um, and I'm lucky because I'm trained in both. So I have the privilege of being able to have somebody come in and get to know them and then to be able to reflect back, here's what I'm hearing and seeing. And does that sound right? And it sounds like working on this. Does that sound right? And um, it sounds like therapy would be helpful. And sometimes I've got to wait a minute before I use the T word. But I think sometimes people just need help getting in the room and being heard and being seen that they're not going to be pathologized, that, nothing scary is going to happen. So I think I've enjoyed actually many wonderful referrals from people who are hesitant to look for mental health counseling. So come to me saying they're looking for performance psychology help when really there's a lot more to address. But having the two coach solution, that's another way to go about it.
Mm,
Um, and there's literature that supports that that is very effective
mm,
because each professional, the performance part, the sports psychology piece, and then the mental health psychotherapy piece, it's like a Venn diagram. Yes, there's some overlap, but each practitioner can focus on
mm,
their area of expertise and you're right. It lifts the client up because then they have this team
mm.
of people who really are pretty on the same page, just addressing different aspects of the self of that client.
Mm. I feel like as well, potentially it's just sort of sprung to my mind that maybe sometimes the bodybuilding coach is worried they maybe would lose a client if the client maybe actually has a revelation that maybe bodybuilding is something they need to step back from. I certainly see this a lot, Lisa, with it's
Mm,
you become the identity, right? So you're the competitor, you're the bodybuilder. And I also
mm,
see it so much where people are scared to step out of the sport. It might only be for a hiatus, right? And they can go back stronger. But
mm,
it's a really tricky space because, of course, when you do competition, you get incredibly lean, probably the leanest you've ever been. You get validation in tons and bucketfuls. And then, perhaps you're struggling post show. And I do get people reach out, and there will be people listening that are on the fence as to, I don't know what to do, but my coach isn't really sort of qualified for the mental health side of things, and maybe it's not their realm, which is good if they're, expressing that. But then the client's like, I've got loyalties to the coach. I'm a
mm.
bodybuilder. I don't really know what to do, and I really do believe it falls back to the identity shift. I'm sure you'll agree.
Yeah, and I'm glad you're bringing this point up because my dissertation, one of my areas of interest is exercise motivation and how people develop that internal motivation to take care of their bodies. And it starts from this very externalized place, for appearance or image or body weight. But all behaviors over time, if we practice them enough and we get competent and we find different ways to engage in some kind of behavior, it can become more and more internally motivated. And the gold standard motivation is intrinsic motivation, which is like the internal state of joy that gets created, right? But just underneath that, there is an external form of motivation called integrated regulation. And it really is the hallmark of a person whose identity is wrapped around the sport. So anytime you put an ER, I'm a bodybuilder, I'm a CrossFitter, I'm a runner, that person is going to do their sport and train for their sport in the rain, in the cold, in the heat, on vacation, during holidays, like because doing those behaviors and being that person is baked into the crust of who they are. So it's very protective. It's very wonderful for somebody who does not have a mental illness or an addiction because it keeps them active throughout their lifespan and they don't need external reward. They don't really fall off or relapse into sedentary lifestyle.
Mm.
And people will ask me, like, well, what about exercise addiction? I'm like, 99% of the population does not need to worry about that. But today I'm talking to you, and I'm talking to you about the percentage of the population that is small, but in your environment, in your ecosystem, is larger, where there's so much need that's getting met out of being that identity. That I am a bodybuilder or I am a, competitor. And there's not really identity outside of that set of behaviors. So they have nothing to fall back on, and it's really scary. So it's such a double bind because that person worked so hard and invested so much of themselves and had so much success. Yeah. And then they arrive at this place where they're asked to abandon this real core of themselves. So I think it's a really challenging problem to face. Somebody's got to be brave and resilient. And the bigger their social support system is, and the more robust their identity is. If they have interests and relationships outside of their sport, that's going to help. But it's a big deal, and they need a lot of support, and they need a team again of people saying kind of what you said, like this is going to be a hiatus to take care of you, and then we could get back to it, or we can see about that. So I think it is a real bind. And if it's just the coach who's worried about client retention, there's a vulnerability there to sort of perpetuate and enable that problem to get worse.
Yeah, you do get that. And I've spoken about this before. Of course, your coach is often on a pedestal, as it were, because they inspire you, right? Like you hire them because
Oh,
maybe
yeah.
or they've got clients that have done well, etc.
Mhm.
And I feel like that bond almost, and this is sort of part of this topic, but almost deviating a little bit. The part of that bond is that, but you don't want to let them down, but you feel this is not right for you at the moment. Maybe there's some personal life things. Maybe the preparation for the competition has brought out a side to you that you need to address, etc. And then
Mm.
it's like, how do I? It's like a breakup. I'd be interested to know your thoughts there because it is certainly something I've touched on, but maybe not delved into on the deeper spectrum of. It's quite hard to actually go. I need to step back from my coach in order to move forward because I get podcast listeners and they say like I don't know what to do. I really
Mm.
don't know what to do here. I'm so loyal as a person, but I need to step back. How do I tell my and I'm like it's difficult, right, for me to advise, someone that listens.
Yeah, and what a difficult decision to make. The professional relationship is unique from all other relationships. So if you have an acquaintance or a friend or a family member, that is a two-way street. That is a bi-directional relationship. That's all about reciprocity and like give and take. And the professional relationship is two people focused on one person,
Love
you
that.
know?
Love
So
that.
the boundary is what's going to serve you. And anything I provide to you, say to you, share with you, do for you is in the service of your goals and why you have hired me. And so the professional, we're really placed in this position where the expectation is higher than it is for friends or family because we have to do what's right for the client. That is the job. And if that means stepping down as the coach or bringing up concerns, that is part of and what I can say is like in my world, it's an ethical responsibility. It's in the textbook, right? So you may have unwritten ethics, but there is that, what is in the service of the client? Rule number one in medicine and in psychology is do no harm. So is what I am doing for my client doing no harm? And if you start to feel any kind of even a yellow flag, like I feel like this is not good for my client, then the onus is on you. It's not on the client. The onus is on you to set the limit and to bring it up. And what I say to my clients, I know there's probably plenty of listeners you have who say this would not work for my business model. What I say to my clients when they need to leave or stop, I say, my door is always open to you. And if I can, I will always, always take you back. You'll be my client forever as far as I'm concerned. I realize stuff might change and like 10 years from now, something might be different, but I want you to know I will always take you back if I can. And I have found that even just saying that provides that unconditional positive regard. Like, you are not harming me by leaving me. This is not about me pleasing me, supporting me. This is about you.
I do feel like as the client, there could be this like, I don't want to let the coach down, or
Oh, yeah.
this type of thing. And often, of course, when we get into something like bodybuilding, I say often, but a lot of people I speak with, you get into the sport because maybe you face some really hard stuff in your life, and this gives you that purpose and that drive. Then
Mm,
you find this person on a pedestal. Maybe you've done well, or like you say, when you get the success,
mhm,
get the team, you get and then it's like, oh, what do I do? And this translates nicely into one of the episodes that's been previous weeks where we had Jose on, and he was talking about, he was with a client coach relationship. He lost a hell of a lot of weight, not for competition, but for lifestyle. And then he was like, I'm going to stop with my coach. And then he found himself in a dark space, and wasn't sure whether to go back. And he actually got into the realms of binge eating, and essentially put on a lot of the weight that he lost. And he was still very, very, highly spoken of the coach, and they're still friends, etc. But also there was that element of suddenly the coach was gone because he felt it was the right decision.
mm,
Then he's in the darkness, and anxiety, panic attacks, etc., and problems in his personal life, and he
mm,
couldn't then get that discipline from what he had before. So you can almost have an aftermath of like a normal breakup, right? Like suddenly you're in this space with no one saying every week, how are you? Have you done your gym? Have you done your food? All of these things. That's probably going to promote a bit of a scare factor as well, would you say?
mm. And in that vignette you just shared, thank you for sharing that because I think probably one thing that didn't get put into the estimation was the importance of that relationship, that support that he had with that coach. Because yes, coaches can ask you that question and help you with accountability, but he did all the things. Like he maintained that deficit, he had the discipline, he did all that work, right? What did he lose? He lost the communication. He lost someone caring about him. He lost someone asking about him, making time and space for him. He lost, to whatever degree that coach was validating him and cheering him on and witnessing his really, really hard work. And so he lost that relationship. And then what did it get replaced with? Nothing, right? So I guess one way to look at it is like, oh, he didn't have the discipline, but he did have it with the supportive relationship. So in my mind, from my bias point of view, it's a lot about the relationship. Like if relationships were not important, everybody on earth would go on AI and say, give me a food plan to be this lean and this strong, and it would do it, but it can't be you. It cannot be human and make space and time and energy for another human. And so I think again, if there was like a collaborative conversation that could have included that, like could there be a new, I don't know. I mean, it could be a book club for crying out loud, but like what's another way to have a village? What's another way to have connection? What's another way to get whatever the support was, that that man was getting from that
Mm,
coach. And
mm.
just an awareness there's more to the relationship than just the X's and O's of, the food plan.
Yeah, for sure. I really love that. Also, as well, it's like there is this relevance on when you get to the leanest you've been. I often think this myself. You know what that takes to get there. And then if you have this dark space and you do struggle, whether it's after a competition, whether it's after a really long diet,
Mhm.
there's definitely a commonality I've noticed over my years of coaching and being in the space that once you've done that phenomenal weight loss or that phenomenal prep, there's almost like I don't want to say PTSD because that's a bit, dramatic as it were, but it's an achievement. But then when you start to put weight on and you come out the back of it, maybe you personal life takes over, etc. I feel like there's
Mhm.
almost this like, blimey, I'd have to do all of that again. Have you seen that at all
Oh
in?
my God.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes. And it's very interesting because while people are in it and they're doing it, I mean, sometimes people are miserable, right? I'm sure everybody has had, yeah. But there's plenty of times when people are like, I'm doing this, I'm crushing this, I'm excited about this, I'm on top of it, that where people feel mastery and they feel engagement and they feel volition. Basically, they feel like they are autonomously choosing to do this really hard thing. So it's like when you're in it, it doesn't hurt as much to think about doing it as when you're not doing it. It's like a runner who, when they're running, they feel good. They stop at the red light and they're like, oh, I got to go again. They feel that. Plus, um, it is very reinforcing to be lean. Of course, society positively reinforces that. There is some dopaminergic response that can start to happen when people are in this like pretty chronic caloric deficit. It can start to feel like kind of good to be underfed, which is sometimes a component of anorexia. So then when people are out of that state, they're not in that state anymore. It feels gargantuan to try to like get back into it.
I'm glad I asked that. You sort of see things happen and you think, is there substance behind this or is it just my brain, And I was actually going to ask you about, and I was going to frame it as, is there such thing as getting addicted to being lean? So you've sort of said that there is potential for that because, again, in the competitive space, you can end up chasing being lean, being lean, being lean, and that can obviously breed the food disorder side of things, the body dysmorphia, etc. And the
Mhm.
ability to then, if you're a competitor, to be expected to gain weight in an off season and get to a point where you're gaining muscle tissue, but of course you gain fat at the same time. Now, this is something I see in males and females where you get to a point in the growth phase and it's like I can't do that anymore, but they want to be more competitive, so that requires more muscle. And there's
Mhm.
a lot of prongs that I've just put there at you. I understand that. It's, I guess, the sort of food disorder and the body dysmorphic side of things. If people do struggle with that point of, being able to eat more off the back of this maybe dopamine response, really enjoying lean, is there certain things other than the coach communicating with them, educating them, etc.? If people are listening, is there any things that people can sort of do other than reach out to the coach?
If they're concerned about what's happening mentally around eating.
Yeah, so if they get to that point so when they're sort of growing muscle tissue and they're seeing the scale weight go up, they're feeling bigger. Obviously, there is body fat accrued as well. If they
Mhm.
find themselves at a point where it's like, I don't want to eat more food. I don't want to get bigger, and they're feeling bigger. The food becomes a negative. If they're
Mhm.
maybe they haven't expressed it to the coach, maybe they're pulling back the food because they don't know what to do. I know
Mhm.
that's quite a big case, as it were, but there will be people listening, I'm sure, that are in this space where it's quite
Yeah.
scary to gain body fat.
Yeah.
Mm.
Yeah. So that presentation, I'm understanding that you're describing. I think what you're asking is what could people do if they feel like they can't reach out to their coach? Whenever I'm in doubt, I kind of like return to the basics. So if I'm talking to a woman or a man, I will ask them, how are you sleeping? How's your appetite? Which that one's much more tricky to answer than sleep, of course, at this point in the game. How are relationships going? How's work going? I sort of want to see like what else is going on. If I'm speaking to a woman, I'll say, what's going on with your period?
Good point.
So I'm trying to find out if there's other markers that something is off or wrong. And, if people are underfed, then their cognitive performance is going to suffer. They're going to be irritable and cranky, and that's going to show up in their relationships, and they're going to have a lot of trouble sleeping. So, those kinds of biological markers I like to go to because they tend to be more black and white than like the emotional side of things. And most athletes know if my sleep is shit, it's going to wreak havoc on the rest of my life. So that's also kind of a place to stick the crowbar. Like
Nice.
you care about that.
Yeah. Yeah.
So if you're up, in the middle of the night for a couple of hours because you haven't had enough calories the day before, is that something to address? So going back to the basics, I
Mm,
think. And then the other thing I like to ask about, and there is a lot of controversy about whether or not things that are not drugs or alcohol could be addictive. So let me just say to anybody who's listening, as a mental health counselor and a psychotherapist, I believe there are plenty of things that are not drugs and alcohol that can be addictions. Neuroscientists might feel differently, but from what I see, if it walks like a duck and it talks like a duck, it's
yeah.
a duck. And so I do see people chasing leanness,
Mm,
and I do see people's behaviors around food getting screwed up. And so one way I talk to them about it is to have them think about their mental pie chart. So if we take the Sarah Parker mental pie chart and, pie chart, there's only 100% that can go in the pie chart. Sometimes I'll have people write it like on a piece of paper. So what's in that pie chart? Like what percentage of time are you thinking about your bills, your kids, your job, getting enough sleep? What percentage of time are you thinking about food? And I don't just mean eating, I mean, how much time are you thinking about not eating? What you're going to eat, when you're going to eat, how you're going to eat, what you're never going to eat again, what you can't wait to eat next, what you feel ashamed of just eating. All of the food thoughts, what percentage of the mental pie chart does that take up? Right. And this is a loaded question for a fitness competitor because depending on where they are in their training, they might be like 90%. Which is why it can be a really risky sport for somebody who has a history of trouble with their eating because the sport lends itself, any sport where there's like a weight or appearance component really lends itself to using perfectionism and rigidity as a coping skill. And then that, as anxiety goes up, then that getting exacerbated and then it backfiring. So let me pause there. I just said a whole bunch of
mm,
stuff.
yeah, I really like that. I didn't mention it earlier, but I like to do sort of I guess I call it homework as it were, but like journaling, writing things down. What are the five? And I've actually got a stage. I've framed it as sort of mindset homework, as it were. Obviously, as coaches, we have our own little ways of doing things, and I don't ever frame that I'm, a mental health practitioner or anything like that. But just for me to learn the client more sometimes, or if there's certain struggles, and I do a similar thing there to the pie chart. So, what are the five things you think about most? And then I've got like the next stage where it's like, what are the emotions that are attached to each of those five things? And if there's more negatives than positives, or however we want to frame that, everything's not positive. But, if there's certain things that are like, well, this is causing me anxiety, this is causing me overwhelm, I don't want to think about this. That type, and then I explore each topic and move along this sort of this homework, as it were. And it's really, really cool to actually learn the clients more as well. And then, as we spoke about earlier, you got data, right? So it's like, oh, can I ask you a bit more about this? And they're like, yeah, cool. And it's a bit more of that partnership. But it also, I find, and I'm sure you're going to agree, when you put pen to paper, this is why journaling's so powerful, isn't it? You take it out of the brain and you see it. It's like I'm thinking about food, as you say, 90% of the time. maybe I have got something I need to address here. Then the client is realizing themselves. It's so important and powerful, isn't it?
Mhm.
Mm,
Yeah, thank you for unpacking what you do with your clients. I think that is such a fabulous example of addressing the whole client and not just their food or their body weight or their leanness, but also taking their emotional life into account as part of what is helpful
mm,
data.
mm,
And often, coaches will ask me like, I want to stay in my lane and I'm a coach, but like, how do I be, psychologically minded? And this is a beautiful example of where you are using all the data of the human being, including their thoughts and their emotions and their behaviors,
mm,
into how you work as a coach. So you are in your lane of doing your job and you do your job better
mm,
when you take into account thoughts and emotions
mm,
and behaviors. So, like, when I talk to coaches about staying in their lane, I say to them, you're not on a road with a lane, you're in a pool with a lane, and the client is the water, and the client's going to bring water from all over the place into your lane. You're not just going to talk about sets and reps and calories. No. All the things, and you should let it come in and let it come out, and you can do your stroke. You can stay in your lane and do your work, and all of that information that comes in can help you do your job better. And so you're really giving such an excellent example of how you integrate really like a holistic approach into working with your clients that is 100% in your scope and in your lane.
mm. Thank you, Lisa. I've never shared that before. It's sort of come out organically there. I feel like there's certainly I have in my own mind. It's like how can I, as you say, it's and I really like that analogy of the water. It's like how can I offer things that are, and it's also like passive activities. So bodybuilding is very heightened, right, or whatever sport someone's doing. So it's like, can you sit down for 10 minutes, just stress really, and learn yourself more. And when you frame it like that, it's not like you're trying. I feel like sometimes if you're in the realms of trying to address that there's maybe an issue or something that's coming up, if the client feels attacked, guess what? Leave me alone, and it does not help. And I know myself from previous experiences with coaches, they weren't attacking me, but when you're heightened, when you're maybe in a deficit, there's a problem. If someone lands that on you, you don't want to talk about it, do you, Lisa? It's very difficult, and that can make you shut down even more and become the robot.
Mhm. Yeah, it really sets off your defenses. And that is distancing in the relationship when what you really could use in that moment is to feel like the coaches gets you and is on the same page as you and sees you,
Mhm.
instead of feeling like you've got to protect yourself against them or distance yourself or,
Yeah.
yeah.
And that as well leads into we were talking about anxiety on one of the other podcasts that I mentioned to you we would cover. That in itself, again, anxiety, it's going to affect people in such a multitude of ways from my own understanding of it. But it is that, when you feel pressure or it's like the anxiety is like an unknown almost, isn't it? Like it's you're catastrophizing potentially about things that haven't happened. It's often things that are happening in the future that cause you to have the anxiety. Again, if someone questions you, that can almost feed an anxious response as well, can't it? And it's anxiety. I mean, we could do a whole podcast on that, right? It's a tricky topic, as it were. But I'd be interested to know your thoughts in, if people are feeling anxious about whether they're bodybuilding as a lifestyle or bodybuilding as a competitor, if they're feeling anxious about the tasks that their coach is setting them to do. So doing the food plan, going to the gym, all of those things, but they don't want to sort of say, I'm feeling a bit overwhelmed here. I don't know what to do. If someone's listening and they're like, I don't want to let my coach down. I've got this plan. I want to commit to it. Would
Yeah.
journaling, things like that be good? Or is there any other things that you could think of if someone does have the anxiety side of things?
Well, the first thing I would say is it is so lovely of you to be caring and thinking about this person who you hired and give money to help you. Like the purpose of the relationship is to serve you. And so, what about you? A lot of people need a reminder that their life is for them and not to please other people, especially those who the beauty of the professional relationship is that I don't have to take 50% of our time to ask how you're doing. Like we could just talk about me.
Yeah.
It is for you. So that would be my first kind of just reflection. And anxiety, I see a lot of anxiety in my professional life because anxiety helps us rise to the occasion. We are naturally selected to be anxious because our ancestors who were super chill, they got eaten by something. They didn't run fast enough,
Something
you
big.
know? So when I work with people who are highly educated, highly successful, highly athletic, they're usually people who are anxious. And so what I like to do is strip away the negativity around that. Like your vigilance and your brain working hard to resolve uncertainty is actually a fabulous thing about you. And how can we help you to use that as a superpower and then minimize the side effects from too much anxiety? And I think your sport in particular really, I mean, it is about exercising control over the environment to these little teeny tiny degrees, where you can see the muscle fibers. It really is about that. So anxiety is about not being able to predict the future. The brain is a prediction machine. So it takes current stimuli and past experience and it tries to make its best guess for what you need in order to meet the moment. So when there is ambiguity or uncertainty, the brain starts working harder to try to resolve. So all of the ways that people are anxious, like catastrophizing, black and white thinking, shutting down, these are all ways the brain is trying to make predictions just so it can settle down and stop working so hard.
Yeah.
Yeah. So people who are naturally anxious, I typically find them to be brighter, conscientious, so they care, they give a shit about life. And so that's why they're feeling that energy. So I like to just recognize like your brain is trying to work hard for you so you can meet the moment. And one of the ways that we try to control anxiety is by controlling our environment. And one of the ways our environment gets inside of us is with food. So I might not be able to control the political climate or global warming, but I can control how many grams of carbs I put into my body.
Yeah.
And
Mhm.
so I think a lot of people who lean into these kinds of sports, fitness sports, you know what I mean, body competition sports, they really enjoy that. Like, if I eat this many calories and do this many reps, I'm going to get this level of lean and this level of strong, and it's going to be black and white and it's going to be relatively predictable. There's a
Yeah.
lot of control,
Mm.
right? Or the sense of control.
Mm.
But then if the anxiety is too high and the calories are too low, the wheels can come off the bus.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I feel like that's gold because as well, it's often that, you can see these patterns forming, like you say, particularly when the deficit clocks up. You don't realize a lot of the time when you're deep in a deficit that your cognitive function is affected. You're like, I'm fine, I'm fine. I'm doing it for my
Oh yeah.
sport. I'm doing it for my sport. And you don't realize until you've maybe done it a few times and you're like, okay, I wasn't okay there. But
Uh-huh.
and what we see is that you can institutionalize yourself because, and you frame that so well for people listening, because actually having that as a framework, as a phrase of you're doing it because you want to do well. And this is what I try and say to people. It's not necessarily a bad thing that you want to stay in the environments that serve you, but there is an element of, as a coach, that I try and teach that when things don't go to plan, or you need to adapt, because that's when it can be like, whoa, what do I do? I can't do my food prep, I can't get to the gym at the same time. And that's where we can see the mental health implications of someone that is very rigid. So I really like how you frame that there. And it's a tricky space to be, isn't it, when you are so rigid and something comes up in your personal life, you forget that you're a mom, a wife, whatever it is. And it's like, but I've got to do my bodybuilding. What do I do, you know?
And people like that, like I feel like they really enjoy having that time and space to be intense, to be committed, to be extra, to be that way. It really gives them an outlet to get to express that part of themselves that is not pathological, is actually a rock star. So what I talk about with my clients is that is so wonderful. And where is the point of diminishing returns, right?
Mm,
So how can you exercise like the maximum level of like you being you and kicking ass? And then when does it start to turn to you're not kicking ass anymore because there's these unwanted side effects or yeah, your cognition or your relationships or your body composition or whatever. And I think that a lot of hardworking type A people have grown up in a more is more and harder work is better kind of life. Like when I listen to clients, I try to listen for what are the morals of the stories or what are the lessons they've learned over the course of their lives that they're sort of reenacting. And a lot of high achieving people have learned if I just push myself harder and work longer and give it more effort, that's going to put me over the top. And this terrible irony that happens to us in adulthood is once you become really high functioning, really high level of athlete or executive, it actually becomes really important to know when to recover, to know when to rest, to know when to refeed, to know when to, right? Because you cannot crank into oblivion without destroying yourself.
mm,
And that's a tough lesson for a lot of people to learn. I think that's where we see chronic injuries. That's where we see relative energy deficiency, where women,
mm,
typically women, are, overtraining, underfed all the time because they have this mindset like more is more. I just have to give, instead of learning, how to kind of live in that zone where you get the optimal return on your investment without running yourself into the ground.
Yeah, it is. It's very tricky, and you often, I see it. You often don't get that lesson until X.
Right? You hit the wall. Yeah.
And
Yeah.
because some people will, over my time, people say, "Oh, I'm at burnout," and I'm like, if you're at true burnout, this is, I mean, you're pretty non-functioning, right? Like it's takes you, and it takes a while to come back from that. You can spot the signs, but sometimes, as we say, it's like you've got to get there before. And also, something that was springing in my mind there, giving yourself permission, I think, is the best feeling, but it's quite hard to get there where you can go, I'm actually just going to sit on the sofa for half an hour. You're allowed to do that, but your narrative is saying, yeah, but I could be doing X, I could be doing X. And I love to frame it as that give yourself permission to do X. But again, you don't want to be condescending, right? To a high functioning athlete or, like you say, exec or something like this.
Well, and that's where I think the relationship, the importance of the rapport and the relationship comes back into play. Because you could probably list for me your clients who would respond very well and would like, ooh, yeah, permission to sit on the couch. And then you could list for me the clients who that's not going to work for them. They need it differently. Like, for example, I have some clients where I would try to be pitching to them you sitting on the couch for 30 minutes is actually going to improve your performance. It's actually going to improve your cognitive power because you're giving it that rest that you need. And so, even though you and I are recommending the same thing with those two different cues, we're saying it to a different audience based on what we know of our
Mm,
client.
yeah.
Yeah.
If you
Like,
can.
how are we going to help them get out of their own way, really, or work towards the goal that they're working so hard toward?
Yeah, it is. It's like, well, if you want to do well and step on stage at your best physique, I'm going to recommend that we do this. And sometimes as well, I'm sure you'd agree, it's a graduated response, right? So if they do X and they're like, that felt quite good. And then they do a little bit more of X, and then suddenly they're doing it regularly without you having to feel like because I feel like there is certainly personalities that are like, I don't want you sort of like dictatoring me and saying you have to do this and they don't want to. Again, that relationship, a huge message in this episode of hopefully people can find that coach and build that team. I always say, when you step on stage and you've got your coach in the audience or if it's online or whatever, you're there for each other, right? It's like, oh God, we've both done it. I love it.
That last thing you're talking about, that's called autonomy support. You are being an autonomy supportive coach when you work hard towards not feeling like you're that authoritarian master and teaching a student. And the number one ingredient in motivation is autonomy. People feeling like they have control over their own lives. So even though your clients are saying, tell me what to do as the expert, like it's the paradox of being a coach is that you're supposed to be in charge, but you're not in charge. The client is completely in charge, and you have to figure out a way to sort of Sherpa them, guide them without taking the reins so that they can be in control of the reins. So I think, again, that's another, like that's part of my continuing education course is how to be an autonomy supportive coach. And you are organically talking about intentionally doing that in your work with your clients.
Mm-mm. I was just thinking, I'd love to get you back on in the future to maybe talk about the motivation piece because, and just a little snippet of what I'm thinking, but motivation, it ebbs and flows, right? And it's not, when people say like, oh, I should be motivated to lose weight or where it is, but I can't find it. And I try and, say motivation isn't the key thing here. A lot of it's autonomy, habits, etc., and understanding your why. But maybe if we could in the future, I'd love to dig into that because I feel like that'd be
Yeah, I love talking about that. And that example is one of my favorites because when the client's like, oh, I don't have motivation, I can't find it. Look what they're doing. They're motivated. Like they're bitching and they're frustrated and they're angsty. That is motivation. Like it's not being leveraged properly. They're not able to utilize that energy, but there is drive, right? And
to
there is an agenda there, but they're saying like I can't harness that. And I think a lot of times people say I lost or I don't have motivation. They're talking about intrinsic motivation, like, oh, I don't have the joy, to like get myself to,
give.
well, you can't have that all the time. But so that is such a wonderful example because I think a lot of coaches get that from people like, oh, I'm so frustrated and I'm so disappointed because I lost my motivation. Well, your frustration and disappointment is motivation. It's just swirling around, and we got to figure out how to hook up the hose so that you can use that, to go after your pursuits. So
Yeah.
I'd love to come back
Yeah,
another time.
that would be really cool to, because I know there's going to be, well, there's different phases, etc. But it's like someone listening to a motivation pod and being like, okay, well, maybe that can get me out of bed than me going, oh, I feel so good today. I'm going to get out of bed and be a rock star. I love it. Now, if people were listening and they wanted to talk to you about, the services you offer, etc., there is people that listen all over the world. Do you do like online? How does that work? If someone wanted to reach out to you, or do you have people that you can direct people to?
Thank you for asking me that. So because I'm a licensed psychologist, the rules are that I'm licensed, in the state of Massachusetts in the USA to provide therapy,
Mhm.
and that's basically it. So what I can extend one-to-one beyond that is like a one-time consultation, which I often do. So somebody might reach out to me from somewhere else in the world, and we can spend an hour or two talking together about what your goals and needs are, and then I'm going to be helping you find whatever kind of practitioner, usually a therapist,
Mhm.
that might be. Sometimes people just want a set of eyes on or an opinion. But then I have my courses, the continuing education courses, which are both called Psych Skills for Fit Pros. So Psych Skills for Fit Pros Volume 1 is motivation, the stages of behavior change, and motivational interviewing. So it's all about helping the client. That one is approved for 1.3 CEU from NASM and the NSCA. The second volume is called Psych Skills for Pit Pros Volume 2, Inside the Coach's Mind. So that is about your psychology and how to leverage that, understand that to help your clients. So professional boundaries, personal mission, your cognitive strengths and blind spots, you know, and your emotional, understanding your emotional life and how your history, your emotional strengths and baggage, how that impacts your relationships with your clients. That one is 8 CEU, NASM, and NSCA. And you can find all this on my website, which is drlewisconsulting.com.
Oh, I love that. I love that. What a privilege to have you on, and I mean that. It's been a really nice conversation, and I will put in the episode description what you've just said there, so people can go straight to the website on the podcast description. But wow, I want to say until the next time because I have to get you back on.
Great. I would love to come back on. It was so great to talk to you. I went to elementary school with someone named Sarah Parker.
Oh, did
So,
you?
yeah, so very familiar name. I felt like I knew you even before we talked.
I love we're kindred
Uh,
spirits.
yeah,
Thank you so
friends for a
much,
long time.
Lisa, and
Yes, I'm happy to come back another time.
thank you so much. I will speak to you soon.
Okay.
Bye.